Hey everyone, Swiss Cheese here. In this video, a companion to my previous title, the last Brim video you'll ever need, I'll show you one of the basic methods I developed for the creation of Boolean Objects, designed for the selective removal and shaping of Brims in Slicer. With the caveat that I've not been able to test these methods in every version of Slicer, and have only verified that they work in the Windows 64 version of PrusaSlicer. Perhaps these techniques will work in versions based on other operating systems. However, I don't currently have them at my disposal for testing. For this demonstration, I will of course be using the Windows version of PrusaSlicer 2.7.1. Now let's jump into Slicer. You'll notice that I've already added an object to the platter, and to this object I've added a Brim as a way to demonstrate our Booleans. To construct our Boolean object, we first need to add an object to the platter. The shape of this object is going to represent the shape of our Boolean. I'm going to go ahead and start by adding a cylinder. And to this object, I'm going to add a part, another cylinder. And I'm going to resize that cylinder to 1.75 millimeters on the X and Y, and 0.2 millimeters on the Z, and drop that to the bed. And I'm going to reposition this part to 125 on the X and 85 on the Y. Now we'll rename that part to handle. You can position your handle anywhere you like. This is just a good starting point in my opinion. Next, we're going to select the part shape cylinder, and we're going to rename this to Boolean shape cylinder. And we're going to go down and resize that on the Z to 0.2 millimeters. Accept that and drop it to the bed. Now we need to add properties to this part. We're going to add infill. Right click again and add layers and perimeters. We're going to set our top solid layers to 0, our perimeters to 0, and our bottom solid layers to 0. The fill pattern of gyroid should be fine. And our fill density we'll set to 0.01. Now I'm going to rename this object. I'm going to call it Cylinder Boolean. And it's ready to do its job. I'm going to drag it into position and slice. And as you see, the area of intersection between the Brim and Boolean has been subtracted. I'm going to take this Boolean for right now, and I'm just going to drag it over to the side of my, or off the side of my platter, and just set it right here, let it relax for a minute, and I am going to create another one of these. This time, I'm going to create a box. So I'm going to add shape, box, to the box object. We're going to add a part, a cylinder, and once again, we're going to resize that cylinder to 1.75 on the X and Y, and 0.2 millimeters on the Z, and drop it to the bed. We'll reposition it, 125 on the X, 85 on the Y, and we'll go ahead and rename that to handle. Now we're going to select the part shape box, and we're going to rename this Boolean shape box. And I'm going to go down here into its properties and resize it on the Z to 0.2 millimeters. Accept that and drop it to the bed. Now we'll add our properties. Right click, add infill, right click again, and add layers and perimeters. And once again, we're going to set our top solid layers to 0, perimeters to 0, bottom solid layers to 0. Gyroid will do fine. And we will set our infill density to 0.01. And I'm going to rename this part now to box Boolean. And it should be ready to go. We'll just take it up and test it real quick. Slice, and it's working great. So I'm going to tab out, and I'm going to drag this part over here and just kind of park it under our first Boolean that we created. Now I want to take a minute and I want to show you how to save these Booleans for reuse so that we don't have to recreate them every time we have a project. I'm going to do this by first getting rid of our example object. All we want left are the tools that we created in our project. And I'm going to go to File, Save Project As, For this demonstration, I'm just going to rename these to first lesson basic Booleans for import. I'll save those and note that we're saving them as a 3MF. Now I'm going to go and open up the original project file. That was our first lesson basic Booleans construction. You'll see that all we have currently on our platter is our example object with its brim. So let's import some Booleans to affect that object. Go to import. We're going to select our first lesson basic Booleans for import and open them. And you'll see that they've opened up on the center of our platter. All of their properties are intact and came with them. I'm just going to move them off to the side of the platter here. I like to leave my tool sets on the side of the platter and copy and paste as needed. In this way, I always have a base set available while working on a project. And we can just copy and paste that and put it in there and slice. And you'll see that they came in working. That's how I construct Booleans for my Brim work in PrusaSlicer. It's quite simple. There is more to know, however. In this next lesson, we'll cover a little bit of that. Now that we have the ability to construct, save, and reuse our Booleans, let's look at some of the ways that Brims interact with our Boolean objects, and a couple of different ways that we can set them up to achieve our desired result. On the platter, I've added a couple of objects, and I've given the box both an inner and outer brim. And I've applied no brim globally to the frog. And just to be clear, I'll demonstrate the difference real quick. There are two ways to apply brims in Slicer. One is through our global settings found in print settings, skirt and brim. And the other is via the object. So we can go to the object, right click, add settings, skirt and brim. Currently, we have our brims applied only to an individual object, the box on the platter. As you can see, I've imported Booleans from our previous lesson, and I've imported brims from a previous tutorial that I made. I'm going to go ahead and grab one of these Booleans, and I'm going to copy and paste it, drag it out onto the platter. Up till now, you've only seen how our Booleans interact with brims applied to individual objects, and I've done nothing globally. Let's go into our global brim settings and see how this will act. I'm going to apply a brim width of 5, and I'll apply a separation gap of 0.03. And that's just the separation gap that I choose to use. Your gap may vary. Now let's go back to our edit view and slice this. And you'll notice that our Boolean took on the global brim settings, and it's been my experience that this is less than desirable, although I'm not going to say that somebody couldn't find a use for this someday, but I generally prefer not to have it this way. And the fix for this is really quite easy. We're going to go to our Boolean object, and we are going to add brim properties. So right click, add settings, skirt and brim, and we will give it all 3 settings. And the thing you may notice is that currently our settings in our object brims are set up exactly the same as the settings in our global brims. That's because they're inherited from there. We're going to turn these back to 0 because that's what we want them to be. And we'll slice again. And now you'll notice that since our Boolean object has its own skirt and brim settings, it no longer accepts the global brim settings. And if we wanted to, at any time, we could come in here and we could change these. I'm going to tab back into my edit view and show you. We are still experiencing the intersection between our Boolean and our brims, and it's being subtracted. And it works the same with our global brims. The area of intersection is subtracted. So the next thing that I want to show you, I'm going to turn off my global brims real quick. Just get rid of that. is that when we're moving this, or if we're rotating it, we can rotate or we can move either the entire object or the part inside of the object. However, if we're going to scale, I recommend only scaling the part inside the object. I'm just going to change this a little bit. Let's scale this, and we'll just kind of move this into position. Now I'm going to take the entire object and move it over here. And I'm going to cut through my inner and outer brims here. But before I do so, I'm going to make a couple of instances. And I'm just going to copy the Y position of the first instance and paste it to the other two. There we go, and I will slice. I want you to notice the difference in the way that our Booleans interact with our outer brims and our inner brims. Now, of course, our inner brims become loops by default. If they weren't loops, we would not have an inner brim. So that's pretty self-explanatory. Our outer brims become truncated. And there's really nothing wrong with these brims. They'll generally print just fine, but there are times when these smaller truncated areas can become so thin that they really don't like to print properly, or maybe they won't hold properly. And when they aren't desirable, the way that we would want to change these is to go to our Boolean skirt and brim properties. And in this case, we're just going to add a 0.01 property to our brim width, and we'll slice. You'll notice now that our brims, our brim extrusions, are contouring to our Boolean cuts. And this works out much better. A lot of times it prints a lot cleaner, and certainly it holds better up against the main object. The other thing that you might notice is that we have these small separations here, and that's due to whatever our first layer extrusion width is and the distance between the two Boolean objects. But we can fix this quite easily. Now in this case, I'm going to take a guess at it, but we're going to use our brim separation, and I'm going to try a 0.2 separation gap, and I'll apply that. And in this case, it actually made it worse. So I'm going to go ahead and step this back. I call this walking it in. I'll make it a 1, and let's accept that and slice. And you can see that that pretty much fixed our problem. For people who don't like to have that little gap there, that's how you would get rid of that. As well, if we didn't have a distance between one Boolean and another Boolean, we could use brim separation gap to increase the distance away from the Boolean if for some reason we just needed to push the brim out a little bit. Now I want to show you something that I mentioned I would show you in my last video. And that's going to be how to remove a little bit more brim from the frog that we applied individual brims to in the previous video. So I'm going to go ahead and make a copy of this brim. And I will just drag that over to my frog and position it. And I'm going to slice that real quick. That came out pretty decent. Well, actually, I might reposition that a little bit. But I want to show you how to remove just a little bit more of this using Booleans. And that's not bad. I'll go ahead and go with that example. So I'll tab back into my edit view. And I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this Boolean. And I'm going to drag this Boolean out. And I'm just going to rotate this Boolean real quickly. And now I'm just going to drag it over into position. And I'm going to use this to subtract more of our brim object. Let's slice this. And you can see now that all we have on the frog's toes is this tiny little bit of brim here, which is really quite easily removed. This is a great technique for getting Brim exactly where you want in the amount that you want. And that really pretty much is it. My recommendation to you is that as you create your Boolean objects, that you add skirt and brim properties to them, and you always leave the skirt and brim properties with them. At any time, you can go in and you can change these skirt and brim properties. And by default, I would set them so that they're at 0 brim width and 0 brim separation gap, and always outer brim only. And they'll just live there with your Booleans. And as you import your Booleans, you'll have all the settings that you need ready with your Boolean objects. What I want you to take away from this lesson is that we certainly could use these Booleans at their most basic, as I showed them to you in Lesson 1. However, if you want to get more control out of them, well, we're taking a step into the intermediate here in Lesson 2 relative to adding Brim properties to our Booleans so that we can control exactly how they interact with the Brims on the platter, whether they be global or object-based Brims. I hope this video helped you. Enjoy.